We are at the house of Ivor Darreg on Polk Street in San Diego, and we are going at first to look at the keyboard instruments that Ivor has made and some that have been given and loaned to Ivor. And first instrument that we're going to talk about is the electronic keyboard Oboe. And Ivor, how long ago did you first start working on this?
Now, the breadboard model of this was made in a hotel room in San Francisco near Gary Street in 1936.
That would put you down at 19 years old, you were at the time.
Yeah, I was just learning that. And
then you moved to San Diego, didn't you, at that point?
Well, we went back to Portland for about 8 months, and then came back to San Francisco and down to Los Angeles, and then by the late summer of 1937, I was in San Diego, actually in La Jolla for a while.
Oh, I see. And that's when the instrument was playable, when you were in the orchestra of John Metzger here in San Diego.
Yes, you see, I had a box made in La Jolla to hold this accordion keyboard and most of the works of the instrument. And so John Metzger took me to and from 2 different orchestra groups that he was teaching, a large one and a small one, and I played this as the oboe and occasionally as the bassoon, by the way.
So, just briefly, one reason why you used this instrument is because you didn't want to go back to square one and have to learn all over again, right?
Yes, I wanted to experience the orchestra from the wind instrument point of view, now that I had experienced it from age 14 by playing the cello in certain groups. And now I wanted the wind instrument standpoint, which is very different. And since oboe players are very scarce, why, I thought that was a logical thing. And also the oboe of the various wind instruments, it's one of the easiest to imitate electronically.
Uh-huh.
So that proved correct, that it blended with the other instruments, that there was no great problem combining it with conventional instruments in an orchestra, so that I thought, way back then, in the 30s, I thought that that's what would happen, that the orchestra would become electronic gradually. Well, I was right about what would happen, about synthesizers and all, but I was very, very wrong about when. It took 50 years.
But you've always been ahead of your time, and you started writing articles in the 40s about electronic music and how it was going to take over, but it took a little bit longer than you thought, didn't it?
Yes. So I can't get in a time machine and go back to 1935 and say, I told you so.
Right. Well, let's have a little demonstration here. Let us know what's going on here.
Well, this is set by means of these formant circuits. These provide the oboe flavoring. You see, and for English horn and other reed instrument flavorings, why different combinations of formants are provided. There are 5 of them in all. And we're using 3. This is why some of the electronic instruments can't do an oboe tone very well, because they don't have 3 formant circuits, and that's what turned out to be necessary.
So what are those?
Now, these push buttons are a depressing keyboard. That is to say, they lower the pitch of anything played on here. And in that case, 1/8 tone for the purposes of vibrato. Now, if you wanted to play quarter tones between these semitones, well, here's one with a Q on it, and that's what that one's for. Then there's a semitone one for trills. That is, this kind of trill will sound rather brittle.
Yes.
And this is better. And then the whole tone. And then these will lower by a larger interval.
So basically, you produced a microtonal instrument there. I don't know if that was what you were trying to do at the time.
Well, I was interested first in getting quarter tones because I had read about them, and of course the quarter tone experiments of the 20s with two pianos tuned a quarter tone apart, and so at least that idea was in the air, as it were.
Uh-huh.
And so I put that on first. And then later, in 1950, I made this little box so that I could have these buttons a little more accessible and the whole thing be neater. And now, to show the change in timbre, we might do that. We can turn these off and turn this on. And that is more like the English horn, you see. So then, if we want a mere echo, a mere ghost of a sound, like a distant trumpet or something, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So, all those. But this instrument was not intended to synthesize or imitate everything. It was intended to be a generalized reed instrument. That is oboe, bagpipe, saxophone, shawm, bassoon, contrabassoon.
Uh-huh.
That is, by changing a capacitor in the oscillator circuit, the pitch can be taken down as far as you wish to go.
Okay, great. Okay, now why don't you just play one little melody and then we'll...
Now, this is a one note at a time instrument, and I should explain that if two or more keys are put down, it will give you a note that otherwise would not be on the conventional keyboard. So even without these buttons, it would still be microtonal in essence.
Oh, I see, by pressing two at once.
So it connects resistors in parallel is what actually happens in the circuit. And so it escaped 12 from the very beginning. Now, there's another thing. While it was a breadboard, I did not yet have this keyboard on here. I made a keyboard out of copper strips. And, of course, that meant that if you were playing the instrument and did not play a perfect legato, you got a shock.
Oh.
So think what some sadistic music teacher would have done to the pupils with that.
Okay, with that I think we'll go on to another instrument.
This is the electric keyboard drum. Please note that I did not say electronic because there are no transistors and no vacuum tubes in it at all. It's strictly electromechanical. It is made of relays of the kind that are used in aircraft, they're used in telephone equipment.
Or they used to be used in telephone.
Well, they're still used to a very small extent, but they used to be, almost everything was done with relays in the old days. And so, if you had ever visited an old-time dial telephone exchange, you would hear the ceaseless clicking of hundreds, nay, thousands of these relays going. It's quite an impressive experience, and of course, I suppose you'd have to travel back about 50 years to hear it now. Well, I discovered some 40 years ago that this instrument, which was made for some kind of electrical experiment, could be used as a drum or percussion instrument with a sort of snare drum effect, and that it was excellent for polyrhythms. So we'll play some of those.
So, Ivor, is this basically the first drum machine on the planet?
Well, it's more or less the predecessor of drum machines rather than their ancestor.
Okay.
You see, the idea is this idea of producing tones without electronic amplification but with electrical equipment has been sadly neglected. And so I have hopes to build a large instrument of this kind, and then a good many groups will want to have them.
How old is this instrument, by the way?
This particular one is at least 50 years old, and probably the relays are 60.
So it dates from 1940 at least?
Yes. And I got hold of it in, let me see, 1944.
Full polyphony also, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. So it permits playing things like 3 notes against 4, which I did there. All right. This is a theremin instrument, or more correctly, theremin vox. Leon Theremin lived in New York City for, about 5 years or something, and was connected with RCA at that time, and then he went back to the Soviet Union later and lived to be 80-something and continued to develop other instruments than this, but very little seems to be known about these other instruments, and there are some Russian books that describe them, but the theremin was very well known around 1928 to 1932, and as a boy I heard it over the radio about 3 or 4 times. Well, the idea is you play the pitches without touching it, and you have absolutely nothing to tell you where a pitch is, and when you played the wrong note, it's too late to correct it, of course, because everybody else is hearing it. And however, it's a spectacular showpiece and has been used in some important movies. Now, what happens is have super wide vibrato with this thing, which of course almost all the players of the instrument did.
And how old is this particular theremin?
This particular thing goes back to about 1950 is when I constructed it, when the disc recorder that was in this box failed and just completely went nothing. Why? So I constructed the theremin, built it in here. If you want, we can show you what's in it. It looks like an old-time radio set in a way. See, it has tuning coils.
And that's all there is to it, huh? That's
Yeah.
the whole thing.
You see, this was long before there were hippies and beatniks that we had beat generation.